My name is Sarah White and I'm the Head of Strategic Communications for the Australia-India Institute. I'm usually based in Sydney, so it's fantastic to be down here and to see smiling faces all in one room after a long lockdown for everyone. I'd like to first by acknowledging the country. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the Wurundjeri lands and who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. I acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge all of you in the room today, including Maria Vapoco, MP, member for Cornwall, Andrew Cumpston, State Director from DFAT, Robert Holland, Executive Director from Economic Development and International Department of Premier and Cabinet Victoria, a range of members from the University's Chancellery Executive, former diplomat John McCarthy, Honorary Enterprise Professor at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education Maxine McHugh, and former federal member Maxine McHugh, who I mentioned before. Welcome also to the guests tuning in online. We're very excited to have you as well, and you'll definitely get an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So to begin, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Lisa Singh, who is the CEO of the Australia-India Institute, to give her opening comments from the leadership and future of the AII. Ms. Singh is a former Australian Senator and was the first female MP of South Asian descent. She is the Deputy Chair of the Australia-India Council and also sits on the advisory committees of the University of Melbourne's Asia Link and the University of New South Wales Australian Human Rights Institute. Would you please welcome my boss, Lisa Singh.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And can I also just start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their associated traditions and customs and elders, both past and present. Good afternoon, everyone here in the room at Melbourne University and also on Zoom, our very first hybrid event for the Australia-India Institute. I am delighted to be the Institute's new CEO. As a long-term advocate for deeper Australia-India ties, with a deep passion in advancing Australia's advancement with India, I'm very excited to lead the next phase of the Institute's growth and in its role in increasing bilateral collaboration. As many would know, the Institute is located at the University of Melbourne. It's the leading centre dedicated to promoting support for and awareness of the Australia-India relationship. And it has contributed significantly to the understanding of contemporary India in Australia since its establishment in 2008. The Institute has established itself very much as a reputable organisation with strong convening powers through the delivery of high quality and diverse programs, including its flagship Australia-India Leadership Dialogue, and through the production of impactful research and policy briefs across a wide range of interests for both Commonwealth and state governments. And the role of the AII becomes more crucial at a time like this, when the bilateral relationship has reached new heights. The last half decade has been momentous for the Australia-India relationship, from Prime Minister Modi becoming the first Prime Minister to visit Australia in 28 years, to the two democracies elevating the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We have indeed come a long way. The fact that there is a commitment now to work together in various areas of significance through defence cooperation, both within and outside the framework of the Quad, through strengthening economic ties with the promise of an early harvest agreement and the proposed comprehensive economic cooperation agreement by next year, and the opening of our borders to Indian students to return bodes us all well, I think, for 2022 and beyond. This year, we've also witnessed the first India-Australia 2+2 ministerial dialogue, where both countries reiterated their commitment to a stable, prosperous and inclusive Indo-Pacific region and expressed their willingness to work together across areas of mutual interest to achieve it. With India burgeoning as the fastest growing economy in the world, the ongoing impact of COVID-19, along with the geopolitical turbulence in the Indo-Pacific and the growing Indian diaspora in Australia, The research and policy work of this institute is incredibly significant to help realise the bilateral opportunities for governments, business, universities and community. The institute wields remarkable influence in reshaping and developing relations, perceptions and scholarship opportunities between the two democracies in India and Australia. Through a framework on the three pillars of geopolitics, bilateral economy and soft power, we will develop a new strategy in 2022 that will ensure continued research and policy engagement that comes out of the Institute is focused on the issues of significance and value to the two democracies across key areas in the relationship. And that is why today's event is so significant. To dive deep into the history and contemporary opportunities and challenges in the bilateral relationship with University of Melbourne's Deputy Vice-Chancellor International and author of the Australian Foreign Affairs Journal on India Rising, Professor Michael Wesley. As we enter the 75th year of India's independence, the Institute will build on its expertise, influence and commitment to ensure the values of freedom, democracy and dosti are celebrated and strengthened throughout our work, our engagement and our biggest asset in our relationship, the Indian diaspora. To all those joining us today in person and on Zoom, I do look forward to your ongoing connection to the Institute as we embark on the next very exciting chapter of the Australia-India relationship and the opportunities that it presents for both our two nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'd now like to introduce Professor Michael Wesley. Professor Michael Wesley is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne and board member for the Australia-India Institute. He has an extensive experience in international strategy and relations and has worked in higher education, government and the private sector. He's published on Australian foreign policy, Asia's international relations and strategic affairs, and the politics of state-building interventions. Previously, Professor Wesley was a Professor of International Affairs and the Dean of College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He was also the Director of the Coral Bell School at the Asia Pacific Affairs at ANU, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute of International Policy, Director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University, and Assistant Director General for Transnational Issues at the Office of National Assessments. Quite a bio. He has a PhD in International Relations from the University of St Andrews. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts, Professor Wesley, on your thoughts of the Australia-India relationship. I'd like to welcome both you and Lisa to the stage to start a lovely Q&A.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you, Michael, for this hybrid event at the University of Melbourne to discuss your new essay on Australia's relationship with India. Very much a thought-provoking read that is worth diving right into. So let's just do that. You write in your essay about the history of the relationship from the time of India's independence in 1947 as one that, apart from the Commonwealth and cricket, brought little of the two countries together. Australia sat very much with the white dominion of the empire at that time. So do you think now that we have progressed the relationship beyond what is coined the 3 Cs, do you think we've actually gone further than where we were? Or do you think in terms of, for example, the new AUKUS partnership, do you think we've actually gone backwards?
Thanks, Lisa. Can I also start by acknowledging Morry Schwartz and Australian Foreign Affairs and the team at Australian Foreign Affairs who approached me to write this essay. I wouldn't have written it other than from the team, and I did enjoy writing it very much. Look, I think we have seen a qualitative advance in the bilateral relationship because I come from the realist school of international relations, which says that nothing brings countries together more powerfully than converging interests. The problem for the first 50 years or so of our relationship with India was that we had no converging interests, or very, very few. So the 3 Cs that you talked about, cricket, curry and the Commonwealth, were not converging interests. They were common memberships and common likes. Neither do I think the fact that both countries are democracies is particularly significant in the relationship. What has really changed is that Australia and India have started to see the world in the same way, and that has brought them into each other's view in really significant ways. From 1947 until, let's just say, 1998, when the nuclear tests occurred in India, Australia and India looked at the world in very different ways. They had very different interests in the world. They had very different focuses on the world. I say in the essay that they kind of looked away from each other, and therefore there was very little that brought them together. There was very little for their leaders to talk about. Bob Hawke and not Sanjay Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi got along very well personally, but there was little that brought them together. I think now we're seeing in both New Delhi and Canberra a growing sense that there is more and more that these two countries can do together.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think, the way they see the world, that is on point. But I guess I'm interested in why this has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you wrote in an essay for the Monthly, actually, in 2012. You talked, I think it was called "The Elephant in the Room." You said India's popularity is only partly about India. So I think that very much goes to the impact of China's rise in the region. And if we look at it now, we have obviously the soured relationship that China and Australia have. So do you think that's the reason? Is it China that has brought India and Australia together?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a disappointed hope for China. I think that from the time we began engaging with China in 1972, there was a thought that somehow China would be a benign presence in our part of the world. And there was a belief among Australian policymakers of both sides that if we engaged with China, if we traded with China, if we treated China as a friend and an opportunity, if we enmeshed China in the sorts of institutions that we were starting to develop in this part of the world, that it would convince China that it was in its interests to comply with the way that the world worked, with the status quo. And I think we got to a stage, and I think it went beyond Australia. I think the region got to a stage by the late 2000s where we started to realise that had not happened, that China had become very rich and very powerful, but had no intention of simply complying with the way that the region had been set up. China did not like a heavy American presence in the region. It did not like American alliances in the region. It did not like a range of other things, and it began pushing against those. And so I think in the context of dreams about China's benignness going sour, India started to rise as, a possible counterbalance to China. I want to say a little bit more about that.
Well, it's funny you talk about counterbalance, because you probably would have heard a recent webinar that I did with former diplomat John McCarthy, who very much used that term of counterbalance. Mm-hmm. That our relationship is worth fostering with India to counterbalance the economic and the military power that China is displaying right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and look, we're not the only country in this part of the world that has made that calculation. I think the United States got to that calculation faster than we did, to be honest. I think Bill Clinton saw it with much greater clarity. I think many Southeast Asian countries started to see it. Singapore stands out as a country that saw itself as the facilitator for India's entry into the Pacific region. Japan got there. Japan began engaging very heavily with India. Korea got there, and of course we did as well. I think there's a very strong sense that a lot of countries in this part of the world have an interest in India's success and India's rise. I think there's a sense in which a lot of countries, other than Australia is certainly one of them, that is thinking about its own investment in India's rise and India's success. I think that's what the US nuclear deal with India was about. I see that as underpinning Japanese and Korean investment in the Indian economy. And I think Australia is very much on board there. As I say in the essay, I can't think of another great power whose rise is attended by as many well-wishers in the world as India's. The last one, I think, was probably the United States at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, but that said, for Australia, we've always sort of attached ourselves, or at least looked at our foreign policy through the lens of attaching ourselves to other powerful allies. India, however, continues to sort of maintain this position of non-alignment. Mm-hmm. So how does that bode well for a new sort of, emerging Australia-India relationship?
Look, we're going to struggle in comprehending India's great power status, because one of the things I argue in the essay is that India is never going to be a conventional great power of the sort that we are used to. We're used to great powers rising quickly economically. We're used to great powers being able to kind of aggregate power and deploy power pretty quickly. I'm very taken by a Russian term, which is that great powers usually have a very clear power vertical. The Russians use the term a power vertical, a very clear idea of who's in charge at the top and how the rest of society's power feeds the power of who's in charge at the top. And you can see Mr. Putin is a great practicer of the power vertical. India will never be that sort of great power. I just cannot conceive of India becoming that sort of great power, the sort of great power that China is, for example.
Do you think that's because it's a democracy? Or?
I think it's because India is so internally diverse. India, to me, is less a country and more a continent. The analogy has been used many times before, but, there is more diversity inside of India than there is inside of Europe. And finding a way of kind of unifying all of that, capability and all of that diversity, I think, is beyond any Indian government. And so India will be this sort of unfamiliar great power for us. I have every reason to believe that India will become, a very significant economic power. It will become, I think, according to economic projections that I have a great deal of respect for, one of the four largest economic powers in the world. Analysis that was done by an economist friend of mine said that by the end of the 21st century, there will be four huge conurbations of economic power. They will be the United States, Europe, China, and India. And depending on the circumstances of what happens to each of those, depends on where they are, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. But there will be four, and then there will be daylight to the next biggest power. So that's the way that the world is going to look at the end of this century. So I've got no doubt that India will be enormous economically. India will be very powerful militarily as well. It's already a declared nuclear power. It will have a much larger navy. It will have very significant armed forces. And I think India will be a great technological power as well. So for all of those reasons, it's going to be a very, very big part of our future, but it won't act like the other great powers will. And I think that's going to take some time for us to get our head around.
Well, I think that diversity is what is so fascinating about India, and perhaps India and Europe will share that in terms of diversity as great power continents into the future. I really am interested in this term that you use in the essay, Heliocentricism. I wanted to ask you a bit about that, because you do write about how Australia's foreign policy has tended to be heliocentric. So, prone to a fascination with one great power,
Yep.
Power dependent on them, the US being an obvious example of that. And, through that, us sort of wanting a seat at the table at all sort of major global events and the like, and doors to open. So how do you see that sort of heliocentric characteristic that Australia continues to sort of cling to, playing out in terms of our relationship with India, who, obviously has this position of non-alignment?
Yeah, well, it's something that complicates our relationship with India. So for folks who haven't read the essay,
it's available down the back.
One of the ways that academics try and build their reputation is by coming up with new terms. And it just occurred to me that there is probably the most significant consistent thread running through our foreign policy is this persistent anxiety that we have too few people to defend too big a landmass. And so from the time of European settlement, we've always sort of gravitated towards, as Sir Robert Menzies said, a great and powerful friend, a great power that could help protect us and protect our landmass from the presumption that there were people who wanted to come and take it off us, which has never been proven. And so what that has meant is that Australia has prioritised always a relationship with a single great power, first Britain, then the United States. It has always seen the world through the vision of that great power. So we've always looked at the world as a strategic whole and thought about the world in those terms. We've always thought that we should have a seat at the top table, and we've always had this fascination with other great powers. So, obviously, from the late 19th century, we were fascinated with the rise of Japan as a military and economic power. From the 1970s, we've become fascinated and then horrified at the prospect of China as this great power. And I think there's an element of us that wants India to look the same. And there are certainly elements of the way that India has started to act that look more like a conventional great power for us. The shedding of the Nehruvian view of the world, the acquisition of nuclear weapons, certainly the willingness to enter into some partnerships like that with the United States. But there are other, as I've just said, there are other elements of India's great power behaviour that will continue to confound us. And I think we will find India to be warm at some times, but standoffish at other times, great power. It won't embrace us in the way that other great powers have, mainly because India does and will continue to value its strategic autonomy. Whether it calls it non-alignment or not, India, I think, will always, according to Rick Smith, which is a terrific phrase, it will always choose its partner according to the music at the time. And so that, in that sense, I think India will be in some ways conducive to our interests. In other ways, it will be maddening for us. I don't think we'll see India completely turn its back on China. India will always have a very subtle relationship with China that is rivalrous in some ways, but cooperative in others. Some would say that's a subtlety that's beyond us.
Well, I think that the BRICS sort of grouping is a good example of that. It's that, you know, they're still sort of operating, and the border dispute's one thing, but the relationship with China for India is a lot broader than that. That's for sure.
That's right.
Look, I want to quote something from your essay. You say, and I quote, Australia, it seems, has started to envisage a substantial role for India in its strategic future, but it is not clear exactly what this role will look like, nor is it clear that India is prepared to play the function Australia may want it to play. So what can Australia do to get more clarity for, you know, on the India side of its willingness to support our foreign policy and our strategic sort of direction?
So the first thing it can do is understand India better than it does. So the work that AII is doing in really raising Australians' literacy on India is absolutely crucial work. I would argue that there are many countries that we are culturally similar to that actually understand India a hell of a lot better than we do. The United States and Britain are just the beginning, I would say. I also think there's, a much greater understanding of India and many of our Southeast Asian neighbours as well than we have. So that's one big area of understanding. Another area that we, need to work really hard on is tempering our expectations of what India will deliver for us. And here I've got particular concerns about the Quad. I think the Quad is geopolitically a natural thing for us to be investigating, a natural thing for us to be investing in, but we shouldn't have too many hopes for the Quad. I think India will invest in the Quad to the extent that it complicates China's capabilities for exercising power in the Indian Ocean. It's what really worries India, I think, is the ability for China, the lead that China has on India in naval capabilities, and the ability for China to become a significant player in the Indian Ocean. My view is that the real value of the Quad for India is bringing the United States and Japan into the frame in keeping China bottled up in the Pacific. The more China is bottled up in the Pacific, the less it can invest in the Indian Ocean. The more China is given a free hand in the Pacific, the more it can invest in the Indian Ocean. So that is India's primary strategic goal for the Quad. But if we expect the Quad to deliver more than that, and India's role in the Quad to deliver more than that, I think we're going to be very disappointed, and that will lead to turbulence in the relationship. That's why I end the essay by saying Australia needs to recognise that the key interest that brings Australia and India together is the stability of the Indian Ocean. We're both Indian Ocean states. We're the two largest military capabilities in the Indian Ocean, and we should really focus hard on that.
Yeah, look, I share your scepticism on the Quad. I mean, it's obviously got a checkered history, but it's at a high point right now in terms of having 4 leaders meet recently in Washington. But yes, we'll see how that all plays out. Look, you also say, in terms of India's growing role in the Indo-Pacific, as you've just mentioned, and how Australia can benefit from this. You highlight that there are challenges for Australia in India's growing role in the Indo-Pacific. Those in Canberra who expect India to rise to power on the steep trajectory sketched by Japan and China will be disappointed. So what do you mean by that?
Well, let me give you an example. The area that has really prospered and you would expect this after what I've just said, in the relationship is the bilateral military relationship, strategic relationship, particularly the navies. So the two navies are the two most forward-leaning bits of our countries that are really engaging with each other, and that is to be applauded. That's a natural trajectory for us, and it's a natural trajectory for India as well. I think that we can start to draw other Indian Ocean littoral states into that. You know, Indonesia is the natural one that we would want to. I think Malaysia is another country we could start to draw into that.
So into the Malabar exercises?
Into the Malabar exercises, but also into common understandings around the Bay of Bengal, the Malacca Straits, that sort of thing, the security of the straits. Obviously, Indonesia and Malaysia are nervous about India and Australia becoming involved, but that's what diplomacy is about, and it's about allaying fears and building trust. The area where we're going to struggle is in economic engagement. India is still, I think, struggling to throw off its kind of protectionist past. I think that Modi's instincts are in the economic engagement camp, but I think he's got really tremendous resistance that he faces internally within India. So the thing about both Japan and China was that as they started to really rise, they opened themselves to the world, and they did it really quickly. And China was an exemplar here, because China threw open the doors and said, if China is going to rise, it's going to rise by importing economic expertise from the outside world. We're going to get the best from the world. And that's been a big factor in China's spectacular economic growth. India has chosen not to do that, and I cannot for the life of me seeing India choosing to do that. So the economic relationship is a vital part of ballast in the relationship, but we are really going to struggle to develop that relationship. It is the biggest challenge for us. I'm delighted to hear it's one of the pillars of AII's work, because it's where we need the most ideas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can't sit on the being the seventh, I think, largest trading partner when we really should be up there in one of the top three for a country with the fastest growing economy in the world. Look, I do need to ask you a question about an area of passion of mine, which you probably know is the role of the diaspora.
Yeah.
We have, the fastest growing Indian diaspora here now in Australia.
Yeah.
They make an incredible contribution to Australia's multicultural fabric. They are full of, high tax-paying professionals, and yet they're not quite as prominent as perhaps we see diaspora leaders in the United States and the UK. So do you have a view on that? How can we sort of utilise our diaspora more, ensure that they have a seat at the table, ensure our parliament is more reflective of our multicultural country?
Yeah, look, it's obviously going to be absolutely crucial. As a member of the Indian diaspora myself, I think it's really important that these linkages are built on and celebrated. I would make a call out to Adi Bhattacharya's piece in the AFA. One of the points she makes is a fascinating one, and that is there is no unified Indian diaspora. There is a diversity in the Indian diaspora in Australia that is reflective of the diversity of India itself.
Yes.
And so thinking that there is this enormous body of people, and it is becoming a really significant part of our population that will speak with one voice is probably something we are going to be disappointed about. But look, my sense is that countries like the UK, Canada and the United States have a significant lead on Australia in terms of how long a sizable Indian diaspora have been resident in those countries. I think my sense is that Australia's Indian diaspora really didn't start to grow significantly until the late 1990s. I remember When I was at school, my sister and I were the only, well, I grew up in country Queensland, so we're the only Asian diaspora in the school. And I remember that a Fiji Indian family arrived in sort of the early 1980s. But there was no thought that there were other Indians. And it was something that country Queenslanders had a great deal of trouble getting their heads around.
I don't think Tasmania was any different. I think I was the only brown girl in school as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, look, you know, looking at where Canada, the UK, the United States are now, I think we can look ahead in the next, say, 20 years, and we can expect to see really significant, Indian diaspora in positions of real power and authority. Possibly, like the UK, will have a treasure of Indian background.
I look forward to that. I mean, I think that's where Peter Varghese made the point in the Indian economic strategy that the diaspora really is the major asset in terms of driving the bilateral relationship too, because they do understand India in a way that so many Australians still do not, other than through that 3C lens.
And I think if I can just say, Lisa, the kind of circulation of the diaspora, which has become so crucial, for example, in places like Silicon Valley. So people from India who go and kind of are educated in California, get jobs in Silicon Valley startups, and then go back to India. And that's created this incredible network that is so important for both economies. Yeah. So that sort of thing, I think, will grow the dynamism of the relationship.
Yeah. So, Michael, we're just about out of time because otherwise our audience won't have time for questions. But I did want to go to the title of your essay, Pivot to India, Our Next Great and Powerful Friend, ? So the question is India our next great and powerful friend? There must have been a reason that you put that question mark on there.
It won't be a great and powerful friend in the way that we've come to expect great and powerful friends to treat us and what we can get from great and powerful friends. But it will be one of several great and powerful countries in this region that will become a permanent part of our geopolitical future. And we need to understand how to treat these different types of great and powerful friends to our interest and to our advantage. So, yes and no would be my answer.
Well, thank you both. That was an amazing discussion. It had such a lovely flow. I didn't want to get up and interrupt it. We'd now like to open the questions to the audience. So if you just put your hand up, Simone will be got a question right there, roving with the microphone. And also I encourage anyone online to write in your questions, and I've got my little post-it notes and we'll be able to read that out. And if you could just introduce yourself, obviously speaking to the microphone.
Sure. Hi, I'm Pavan Gantok from representing Jindal Global University. Michael, thank you so much and Lisa, wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing those insights. I was just wondering if either or both of you would want to comment a little bit further on what other pillar within the economic area, what other ways can we strengthen the economic leg of that India-Australia relationship other than the geopolitics? And what is an open question? And secondly, a specific reaction to the proposition that perhaps investment-led rather than trade-driven approaches to strengthening that economic relationship might be more fruitful in the Australia-India context. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some pretty obvious pillars that can come out of the economic relationship. The most obvious is higher education. You've got India with a country of nearly 50% of its population under the age of 25. The demand for education and skills training is only going to increase, and Australia needs to be ready and robust and open to ensure that, you know, it is a country of choice for higher education and vet training. That's why it's, you know, one of the major sort of examples in the India economic strategy. But the other one, I think, is infrastructure. And this is where Australia has trillions of dollars in investments in superannuation. India has a very strong agenda on, you know, making India smart cities. So the demand for infrastructure investment from Australia is huge, and I think it definitely needs to be one that we're, you know, tapping into and engaging with India on.
We have another question down the front. Someone on the end, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Van Vaken, the member for Cornwall. Very interesting discussion, thank you. And I'm going to ask a question on the diaspora. I'll just very quickly say that of the 12 online citizenship ceremonies I've taken place in the last 7 weeks, 75% taking up citizenship from my electorate are from the subcontinent and from India in particular. I have a very large constituency, therefore a very large Indian diaspora. My question is, often we in Australia look to the diaspora communities to assist us in our engagements, in our multilateral and bilateral relationships. India will have a very large diaspora here in Australia, one that's going to have a significant impact as we move into the next 50 years on the changing formation of the Australian identity. Is India likely to see the importance of that diaspora here, of benefit to it, and therefore as a result, perhaps interact with Australia in a way that is of benefit to Australia as well?
Very good question, Maria. Well, I mean, I think the Ministry of External Affairs in India does take its diaspora in 146 countries, but mind you, seriously. I mean, it does it through a range of activities. It has a minister focused on it. It has awards for those diaspora or people of Indian origin building sort of diaspora engagement. So look, I think the commitment is there from the Indian side. We obviously need to make sure that, you know, we're engaging with our diaspora to make sure they're valued as much, you know, on the Australia side, though.
I guess I would add, yes, there is a large and growing Indian diaspora in Australia. What I would love to see is a proportionally large Australian diaspora, maybe not living in India, but with a knowledge of India. And so I think as educational institutions, we have an enormous interest in encouraging our students, our young people, to go and spend time in India to get to know it. In fact, we were just talking with Jindal University yesterday about how we can really uplift our student mobility to India and really facilitate greater knowledge among, you know, all of our younger people about India. And what we find is that when someone has an experience like that, it can be for as little as 3 weeks. It raises the likelihood that they will go back, and they will go back, and they will go back. You know, it's really interesting the number of Australians who, in a discussion like this, will tell you a personal story about having gone to India. My first week at the University of Melbourne, almost 2 years exactly ago, was on a delegation led by Dan Tien. And Tien told pretty much every audience about a really kind of life-changing visit he'd made to India as I think a boy, a teenager, and how it led to this incredible relationship. Tony Abbott was another one. Bob Hawke was another one. So you know, it's astounding the number of our political leaders who have gone to India and had a completely transformational experience, and we need more of that.
Yeah. I think that might be an opportunity also for me to give a plug for the Institute. We've been commissioned by the federal government to launch a fellowship program next year that will enable Australian higher ed postgrad students to go to India for a period of time to do just that.
We now have a question from online, so it's come through by our very technical post-it note. Australia looks for the big picture comprehensive agreements, versus India prefers to work deal by deal. Different worldview, and India is rightly suspicious that the free trade agreements advantage the West at the expense of Asia. How can the two come together without some give and take from both? Do you think Australia will adopt to gain early harvest deals?
I think we have to. I don't think we're going to get a big comprehensive free trade agreement with India anytime soon. And I think, you know, a very pragmatic approach, such as the government is taking at the moment in finding early harvest deals with India, building trust that way, building mutual value that way is the way forward.
I mean, I think dear Andrew Robb tried so hard to get the big ticket item of the free trade agreement with India over the line. I think it was about 8 or 9 trips in 1 year in really trying, and it you know, obviously it didn't prove. And there's a number of reasons for that. You know, India's economy is moving from an informal to a formal economy. It still has a very strong agrarian, base to it. So that there are vulnerabilities for India that need to be taken into account. But at the same time, that should not stop us from trying to find those small wins. So I think everyone's waiting with bated breath to see what the first early harvest will look like.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great way to end. And thank you, Lisa and Michael, for such an amazing discussion. I'd like to put our hands together and thank them for such a great discussion. Finally, I'd now like to invite Morry Schwartz up to provide a vote of thanks. Morry Schwartz is the founder and publisher of Schwartz Media, whose publications include the Australian Foreign Affairs, Quarterly Essay, The Monthly, The Saturday Paper, Jewish Quarterly, and the podcast 7am, and of course the book imprints Black Ink and La Trobe University Press. Thank you, Morry.
Honourable Lisa Singh, who is the CEO of the Australia India Institute, Professor Michael Wesley, who's a Deputy Vice-Chancellor International, University of Melbourne, and Sarah White, Head of Strategic Communications, Australia India Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the Australia India Institute for hosting this event. If there's a theme running through all the pieces in this latest issue of the Australian Foreign Affairs, it is that if we genuinely want to form a partnership with India in a fast-changing Asia, we will need to have a much better understanding of India, its interests, its politics, its aims, and its culture. The Australia India Institute is crucial in developing that understanding in Australia, so we are delighted to be partnering today. Thank you, Lisa Singh, for moderating this event. Lisa actually makes an appearance in this issue of AFA in Arti Bhattacharya's enlightening essay about Australia's Indian diaspora community. Arti makes the point that the Indian communities had almost no political representation in Australia. She notes that there is Dave Sharma, but she says there's no evidence that he's waved the flag in Parliament on behalf of the Indian diaspora. And then she discusses Lisa, who Atari writes was the first Australian of South Asian descent to be elected to federal parliament and spoke about these issues when she was in office. So Lisa, we're honoured that you could host this event. I thank the 4 contributors to the India-Australia section of this AFA, Sniga Poonam, Harsh V. Pant, Arti Bhattacharya, and of course Michael Wesley. There are many apparently well-known things that I wasn't aware of. Arti Bhattacharya tells us of the extraordinary increase of our Indian-born population from 30 here in Australia, from 37,000 in the year 2000 to 721,000 in June last year. That's a 20-fold increase in 20 years, unbelievable. And that there is much unhappiness amongst these people about the treatment that Australia gives them. And this is something that really must be fixed. Snigdha examines the anti-China sentiment in Modi's India to the point of banning TikTok over there. Fascinating essay. And Harsh gives us the perception of Australia from India and the opportunities to reshape the relationship. Michael Wesley, thank you for writing a typically compelling essay in this issue about Australia's challenging relationship with India. This is the 13th issue of Australian Foreign Affairs, and we're very proud that Michael has now written 4 essays for AFA, more than any other writer, though Hugh White, Linda Javan and George Megalogenis are catching up fast. In his essay in this issue, he looks with clarity at the vexed history of Australia's ties with India, about the prospects of a new partnership, particularly as Australia's ties with China deteriorate. As Michael notes, for most of its post-1788 history, Australia has ignored the Indian Ocean. And as we've heard today, Australia clearly can no longer afford to ignore this Asian giant, India. Thank you all for being here, for coming out, and just to note that there are books up the back, there are AFAs, not only this one, but some previous ones as well. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Morry. My job was to point you guys towards buying the books, but people online can also buy the books at a discounted rate in the questions box. Apparently we had so many questions coming through online that we didn't have time to get to it, but I will send them both to you guys and you can write them up this week. So we'll work out. We'll get back to you with all the questions. Thank you so much for the engagement.